The signal reached Earth at 3:47 Coordinated Solar Time, and for 11 minutes no one on the receiving deck of Farpoint Relay Station spoke, because there was nothing a human voice could say that would not have been an obscenity. It came in on every band at once. That was the first thing the technicians noticed before the images resolved, before the meaning arrived like a blade sliding between ribs. The Vurhaan Ascendancy had not sent a coded burst or a diplomatic packet. They had flooded the spectrum, hijacked the courier lattice that carried mail and news and lullabies between the colonies, and forced their broadcast into every screen and speaker and neural relay that humanity possessed. They wanted it seen. That was the point. A crime hidden is a crime a criminal is ashamed of. This one was framed as a triumph. The colony had been called Meridian Reach, 10 billion people, a ring of orbital habitats and 3 terraformed moons circling a quiet amber star at the edge of the Orus Drift, far enough from the old borders that the families who settled there had believed themselves safe. They grew wheat under artificial suns. They raised children who had never seen Earth and never expected to. They had a symphony orchestra and a fishing fleet and a stubborn local pride about the quality of their pears. Meridian Reach was not a fortress. It was not a threat. It was a place where people lived, which was exactly why the Vurhaan chose it. The broadcast opened with a wide shot of the colony hanging jewel-bright against the dark, and then a voice narrated over it, smooth and unhurried, in a Vurhaan dialect that the translation engines rendered into flat human words. The voice belonged to Warden Primarch Ascendancy, and he wanted the galaxy to understand that what followed was a demonstration, a lesson in scale. The lower species, he explained, had grown insolent. They had spread across sectors that did not belong to them. They had bred without permission and settled without deference and forgotten the natural order in which the Ascendancy sat at the summit. And so the Ascendancy would remind them. Then the fleet fired. The technicians on Farpoint watched the habitat rings come apart. They watched the terraform anchors on the 3 moons overload in sequence, watched atmospheres boil off into space in silver plumes that the Vurhaan editors had color-graded for maximum beauty. They had scored it with music. That was the detail that would later break something loose in 100 billion human hearts. The Vurhaan had set the death of 10 billion people to a swelling orchestral theme, the way a conqueror scores a hunting film. Warden Primarch Ascendancy narrated the tally as it climbed. He named the population figures. He noted, with the mild satisfaction of a man reviewing a ledger, that the operation had been completed 40% ahead of schedule. At the end, he looked directly into the recording eye and made his one and only demand, which was not really a demand at all but a coronation of the act just committed. "Let this be witnessed," the translation read. "Let every lesser people who has crept into our stars look upon Meridian Reach and understand what they are permitted and what they are not. We do not negotiate with the swarm. We prune it." Then the signal cut, and the 11 minutes of silence began. Commander Aveline Sarne was 26 years old, and she was asleep in a bunk aboard the patrol frigate Ganymede's Vigil, when the ship's alert brought her up out of dreamlessness into a room that had gone the color of an emergency. Red wash on the ceiling. The soft, insistent chime that meant fleet-wide, not local. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, which was a thing the Academy had drilled into her until it lived below thought, and she was pulling her jacket over her shoulders when the duty officer's voice came through the bulkhead speaker and told her, in a tone she had never heard from him before, to come to the bridge and not to look at the open channel on the way. She looked at the open channel on the way. Everyone did. By the time she reached the bridge, she had already seen enough of it to understand that the shape of her life had changed. Aveline had grown up on the second habitat of Meridian Reach's sister colony, Halden's Green, 6 light-years from the Reach, close enough that her school had exchanged letters with a school on the Amber Star moons. She had a pen friend there once, a girl named Tessie who liked the same music and wanted to be an engineer. She did not know if Tessie had grown up and stayed. She did not know if Tessie had been under one of those atmospheres when it boiled. She would never know, and the not knowing would sit in her chest for the rest of her life like a stone swallowed whole. The bridge of Ganymede's vigil was small and utilitarian, built for a crew of 40, and every one of the 40 was there, standing, because no one could bear to sit. Captain Roux was at the forward station with his hands flat on the console, as though he were holding the ship down against a wind. He was 50 and he had fought in the border skirmishes 20 years back, and he had the settled, weathered calm of a man who had already used up most of his capacity for surprise. When Aveline came in, he did not turn around. He said quietly, "You've seen it." "I've seen it, sir." "Then you know we don't have orders yet." He straightened. "But they're coming, and when they come, they're going to matter more than any orders any of us have ever taken. So I want everyone thinking clearly. I want everyone alive in their own head. Do you understand me?" He said it to the whole bridge, but his eyes found Aveline's because she was the youngest officer aboard and because grief did strange, fast things to the young. She understood him. She held on to it. Around her, the crew's faces were doing the thing that faces do when the mind is refusing an impossible sum. The eyes wide and dry, the mouth working slightly, the animal part of the brain still hunting for the trick, the edit, the version where it wasn't real. 10 billion. The number would not fit inside a person. You could not grieve 10 billion. You could only stand in the doorway of it and feel the cold air coming out. "Sir," said the comms officer, a soft-spoken man named Delacre, "Fleet Command is convening the whole line, not just our sector, all of it. They're recalling the deep patrols. There." He stopped. He read the next part twice before he said it aloud. "They're waking the reserve." That landed. Even the ones who had never served near the old wars knew what the reserve was, in the way that people know the names of old plagues. Humanity had spent 70 years at a careful, watchful peace. It had built colonies and orchestras and argued about pairs. But underneath all of that, mothballed in the dark between the stars, it had kept the thing it had built during the last great fear and had prayed never to need. Not a fleet. Fleets could be counted. The reserve was the industrial capacity to make fleets faster than an enemy could destroy them, coupled to a doctrine that humanity had written down once, sealed, and hoped to leave sealed forever. The doctrine had a name. It was not a name anyone said lightly. On the bridge of Ganymede's vigil, Captain Roux said it, because someone had to, because saying it made the future real enough to prepare for. "They're going to invoke requital," he said. 2,000 light-years away, in the low orbital ring above Geneva, the Terran-conquered assembly met in continuous session for the first time in its history. 900 delegates. Every human world, every habitat cluster, every scattered outpost that could reach the vote. They did not adjourn. They did not go home to sleep. They sat in that great curved chamber under the projection of the murdered colony. Someone had put it up on the central display. The last clean image of Meridian Reach before the fleet arrived. 10 billion lives rendered as a soft point of light. And they debated what a civilization owes to its dead. There were voices for restraint. There are always, and there should be, voices for restraint. An old delegate from the Martian cantons rose and warned that grief was the worst possible architect, that a people who answered atrocity with atrocity would become a second Vurhaan wearing a human face, that the galaxy was watching and would remember not only what the Ascendancy had done but what humanity did next. She was not shouted down. This is important, and it would matter later. She was heard in full in silence, and when she finished she sat and wept, and no one called her a coward because she was not one. But then a younger delegate rose, a woman from the outer habitats named Soria Ven, and she said the thing that turned the chamber. She said, "The honored delegate is right that we must not become them, and we will not. Hear me, we will not. But there is a difference she has not named, and the difference is the whole of the matter. The Ascendancy killed 10 billion people who had done nothing to prove that they could, and to make the rest of us afraid to exist. That is what they did. Now, if we answer by killing their children, their farmers, their poets who never sat on a war council, then yes, we become them, and we deserve the name. But that is not the only answer. there is another. We can reach into that empire and take out the hand that did this, the fleets that fired, the wardens who gave the order, the machine that made it possible and the impunity that made it thinkable. We can end their power to ever do this again precisely, completely, and leave the innocent alive to inherit a world without the monsters who ruled it. That is not vengeance. That is not genocide. That is justice with the safety off. And I will not sit down until this assembly votes to deliver it. She did not sit down, the assembly voted. And humanity, which had spent 70 years learning to be gentle, remembered in a single night that it had once been something else, and chose, coldly, deliberately, with its eyes open and its restraint intact, to be that thing one last time. Aveline learned the shape of the operation the way most of the fleet learned it, in a briefing so quiet you could hear the ventilation. The order had a name now, released to every ship and station simultaneously, and the name was doing exactly what it had been chosen to do. It was in every mouth. It was on every screen. The enemy would hear it soon enough, and they were meant to. Operation Alien Extinction. Captain Roux stood in front of the assembled crew of Ganymede's Vigil in the ship's largest compartment, and he explained, in a voice stripped of everything but fact, what those 2 words did and did not mean. He explained it because Command had ordered every captain to explain it personally to every human under their command, before a single ship moved. Because Command understood something about the machine it was about to unleash. A machine like this could not be pointed at an enemy and merely trusted. It had to be aimed by the conscience of every person who touched it, or it would become the very horror it was built to answer. The name is a message, Roux said. It is aimed at them. The Vurhaan called us a swarm to be pruned. They called us vermin, a lesser species, a thing to be exterminated. So we have taken their word for it and turned it around, and we are handing it back to them, engraved. Extinction. We want the wardens of the Ascendancy to read that word on the side of every hull that comes for them, and we want them to feel what our people felt in the last minutes over Meridian Reach. We want them afraid. That is what the name is for. He let that sit, then he sharpened it. But you are not soldiers of extinction. Hear me, every one of you, because I will hold you to it, and so will the person standing next to you. We are not going to their homeworlds to boil their atmospheres. We are not going to score the death of their children to music and broadcast it to the stars. If any of you ever does, if any human in this fleet ever crosses that line, then Meridian Reach died for nothing, because we will have proven the Ascendancy right about what we are. So here is the operation, and here are its walls, and the walls are not suggestions. They are the operation. And he told them. The targets were the war apparatus of the Ascendancy and nothing else, the fleets that had murdered Meridian Reach, the shipyards that built them, the command nodes, the wardens, the primarchs, the whole crowned pyramid of officers who had planned and ordered and celebrated the atrocity. Their capacity to make war would be dismantled to the last dry dock. Their leadership would be found wherever it hid and brought to an end. Their impunity, the belief, 70 years deep, that they could kill anyone below them and pay nothing, would be broken so thoroughly that no Vurhaan child would grow up believing it could be done again. And around that violence, humanity would build a cage of restraint that it would enforce upon itself with more ferocity than it aimed at the enemy. Civilian worlds would not be touched. Populations that had not raised a hand would be shielded, warned, evacuated where possible. Any Vurhaan who laid down arms would be taken alive. Any human who murdered an innocent under the cover of the operation would answer to a human court for it, and the courts had already been convened, empty and waiting, before the first shot was fired. The message to the enemy was extinction. The discipline behind the message was mercy held on a chain, snarling but held. We are going to be terrible, Captain Roux finished. We are going to be the most terrible thing these people have ever seen, and we are going to be terrible only to the guilty. That is the whole of it. That is the hardest thing anyone has ever asked of a fighting force, and we are going to do it, because the alternative is to let them make us into a mirror of themselves. Dismissed. Aveline stood at the back of the compartment and felt the two halves of the operation lock into place inside her like the halves of a rifle bolt. The grief and the restraint, the extinction and the mercy. She was 26, and she had lost a girl named Tessie she would never be able to prove she had lost. And she wanted, in the animal center of herself, to burn a whole species down. And she understood, standing there, that the entire meaning of what her people were about to do lived in the space between what she wanted and what she would allow herself to take. The Vurhaan Ascendancy did not, at first, take the response seriously. This was recorded later in captured logs and intercepted councils, and it is worth understanding because it explains why what followed came at them the way it did. In the days after the Meridian broadcast, while humanity sat in continuous session and woke its reserve and etched two words onto the sides of its ships, the wardens of the Ascendancy convened in their high citadel above the homeworld of Vurhaan Prime and reviewed the situation with the languid confidence of predators who have never been prey. They had done this before, you see. Not at this scale. Meridian Reach was the largest single culling in Ascendancy history, and Warden Primarch Aveline was already having medallions struck to commemorate it, but the principle was old and proven. The Ascendancy had risen over 400 years by exactly this method. Find a rising species, let it grow fat and comfortable and spread across a few systems. Then, at the moment calculated to cause the most terror in the most neighbors, erase one of its worlds utterly and broadcast the erasure. The survivors always did the same thing. They raged. They wept. They gathered whatever pathetic fleet they could and flung it at the Ascendancy border, and the Ascendancy war machine, vast, ancient, industrial on a scale the young species could not imagine, ground the fleet to slag and then culled a second world to finish the lesson. Within a generation the species had learned its place. It paid tribute. It kept to its allotted stars. It taught its children to look up at the Ascendancy with the correct proportion of fear. The humans, the wardens agreed, would follow the pattern. They were a young species, barely a few centuries off their homeworld. They had a small navy, competent but unremarkable, built for patrol and pirate suppression. They had never fought a real war against a peer power because there had been no peer power near enough to fight. They would come raging to the border with everything they had, and the Ascendancy would break them there. And then Aveline would cull a second human world, and in 30 years there would be a human tribute delegation kneeling in this very hall. Warden Primarch Aveline was so certain of this that he did not even redeploy the fleet. It sat where it was, in the staging systems along the Oris Drift, resupplying from the Meridian operation, its crews rotating through leave. Aveline spent the days after the atrocity commissioning a triumphal frieze for the Citadel wall and drafting the demand he would present to the humans once their counterattack had been broken. He was, by every account, in an excellent mood. He noticed the first sign of trouble the way a man notices a change in the weather while indoors, indirectly through the behavior of others. His fleet dispositions officer came to him with a report that the Ascendancy's forward listening posts along the Oris Drift had gone quiet. Not destroyed. Destruction would have been an event, a flash, a distress burst. Quiet. One by one, over the space of a single Vurhaan day, the deep space sensor buoys and the frontier watch stations that formed the Ascendancy's early warning net simply stopped reporting. When queried, they did not answer. When couriers were sent, the couriers did not return. Aveline was annoyed but not alarmed. He assumed a systems fault, or a solar event, or at worst a probing raid by whatever human vanguard had arrived first, testing the border the way young species always did. He ordered a squadron out to sweep the frontier and re-establish the net. The squadron did not report back either. What was happening along the Oris Drift in those quiet days was the first movement of a doctrine humanity had written 70 years earlier and prayed never to use, and its first principle was this: you do not announce yourself to a machine of impunity. You unplug its eyes before it knows its eyes are closing. Aveline Sarne was part of it, though at the time she understood only her own small piece. Ganymede's vigil had been folded into a formation designated Scalpel Group, one of dozens, and Scalpel Group's task was not to fight. It was to blind. For 4 days the frigate ran dark and cold along the edge of the drift, its engines throttled to a whisper, its hull chilled to the temperature of the void so that no Vurhaan sensor could distinguish it from a drifting rock. And one by one, Scalpel Group's ships crept up on the Ascendancy's listening posts and killed them without a sound. They did not kill them with weapons, mostly. That was the elegance of it, and Aveline would remember for the rest of her life the cold precision of those nights. The frigate would drift up alongside a listening post, a spindly Vurhaan structure bristling with antennae, crewed by a dozen bored technicians who had spent years watching an empty frontier, and the intrusion team would slip across in silence and take the station systems from the inside. No explosion, no distress burst. The station kept broadcasting its regular all-clear signal back to the Ascendancy, except that now humans were writing the all-clear, and the station's ears had been turned off, and its dozen technicians had been taken alive into the frigate's hold, confused and terrified and, crucially, breathing. That was an order, too, and it came from the same place all the walls came from. Aveline had heard some of the intrusion crew grumble about it on the first night. Why were they nursing a dozen enemy technicians through a raid, spending medical supplies and guard duty on the very species that had murdered 10 billion, when it would have been so much simpler and faster to vent the station and move on? And the intrusion team leader, a hard-faced sergeant named Okonkwo who had lost a brother's family on one of the Meridian moons, had answered in a voice that ended the discussion. "Because a listening post tech is not a war criminal," he said. "Because if we start killing the ones who are easy to reach because they happen to be closest, we are not doing the operation, we are just doing murder with the operation's name on it. And because," and here his voice had changed, gone quieter and harder, "these 12 are going to tell us where the fleet is. The dead don't testify." They did tell. Not under torture. That was another wall, and it held. But because the humans who questioned them were patient and unhurried, and because the technicians, once they understood they were not going to die, discovered they had very little loyalty to an Ascendancy that had staffed a dead-end frontier post with them and forgotten them for years. Piece by piece, from a dozen listening posts and a captured courier and the raided squadron whose crews had ejected into the dark and been scooped up alive, the picture assembled itself in the tactical holds of the human fleet, where the Meridian fleet was resting, which shipyards fed it, where the wardens made their decisions, where Ascendancy sat commissioning his frieze. Humanity spent those quiet days building a map of guilt, and it drew the map with a care that bordered on obsession, because the whole operation lived or died on the accuracy of that map. Every node on it was interrogated the same way. Not "is this Vurhaan," but "is this part of the machine that killed Meridian Reach, or is this something else?" A shipyard building warships for the culling fleet went on the map. A civilian foundry 3 systems away making agricultural machinery did not, and was flagged instead as a protected site, its coordinates distributed to every human commander with a one-word instruction attached: spare. A command node where wardens planned atrocities went on the map. A university, a hospital ring, a farming habitat, a city of 11 million ordinary Vurhaan who had no more chosen the culling of Meridian Reach than a human child on Halden's Green had. These went onto a second map, a longer one, and the second map was in some ways the more important of the two, because it was the list of everything humanity was going to reach past. Aveline saw both maps, the night before Scalpel Group's work was done, and the fleet began to gather for the second movement. She sat in the frigate's tactical hold and watched the 2 projections hang side by side. The map of guilt was terrible and precise, a scattered constellation of shipyards and staging systems and command citadels, each one tagged with the evidence that placed it there. The map of the spared was vast. It was, in truth, most of the Ascendancy, hundreds of worlds and thousands of habitats full of people who would wake up one morning to find that a war had happened around them and over them and had, deliberately, not touched them. "That's the part they won't believe," said Delacroix, the comms officer who had come to stand beside her. "When it starts, they'll think it's a trick. They've spent 400 years erasing whole worlds to make a point. They literally do not have a concept for an enemy that comes for the guilty and leaves everyone else alive. It's not in their language. We're going to do a thing they can't even imagine, and the not imagining is going to be half of what breaks them." Aveline looked at the two maps a long time. She was thinking about Tessie, the engineer girl she'd never see grown. She was thinking about the 12 terrified technicians in the hold, alive, who would spend the war as prisoners and then go home. She was thinking that both of those things had to be true at once, that the whole meaning of what her species was doing lived in holding both of them, and that it was the hardest arithmetic she had ever tried to carry. "Half of what breaks them," she said. "What's the other half?" Delacroix nodded at the map of guilt, at the constellation of shipyards and staging systems, and the citadel where a warden was commissioning a frieze. "The other half," he said, "is what happens when the eyes we just closed open again and see what's already inside the room." The second movement of Operation Alien Extinction did not begin with a declaration. Humanity had considered issuing one. There were delegates in the Concord who argued that a formal statement of aims should precede the first engagement, so that history would record humanity's restraint from the outset. In the end, a different choice was made, and it was Aveline's generation, the young officers who would actually execute the thing, who understood best why. A declaration to the Ascendancy leadership would have been an invitation to the leadership to hide behind civilians. It would have let the wardens scatter into cities, dig into hospital rings, wrap themselves in the very innocence humanity had sworn to spare, and dare the humans to dig them out at the cost of their own principles. The Vurhaan had done exactly this in past wars against lesser species, and it had worked, because those species had been forced to choose between letting the guilty escape and slaughtering the shields. The Ascendancy war machine had learned to survive by wearing its own people as armor. So humanity did not declare. Instead, it did the thing that the Ascendancy's 400 years of impunity had rendered literally unthinkable. It arrived at the war machine directly, all at once, everywhere, before the leadership understood there was a war at all, and it took the machine apart faster than the wardens could reach the civilians they would have hidden behind. The staging systems along the Orus Drift, where the Meridian fleet rested, crews on leave, magazines half empty, sensors newly blind, woke on the fifth morning to find the human fleet already inside their formations. Not approaching. Inside. Scalpel Group's quiet work had blinded the frontier so completely that the main human force had crossed it undetected and deployed in the dark between the resting Vurhaan ships. And when the order to begin was given, it was given from a distance measured not in light years but in kilometers. Aveline was on the bridge of Ganymede's vigil when it began, and she would spend the rest of her life failing to fully describe it to people who had not been there. The human fleet did not open with a barrage. It opened with a message, transmitted on every Vurhaan military band at once, and the message was not words. It was the last clean image of Meridian Reach, 10 billion lives as a soft point of light, followed by 2 words in the Ascendancy's own script, the word they had used for humanity, turned around and handed back. Then and only then, the human fleet fired. Not at cities, not at civilian traffic, not at the university worlds and hospital rings and farming habitats on the long second map, but at the resting fleet of the guilty, at the shipyards that fed it, at the staging depots and the magazine ships and the command vessels where the officers of the Meridian culling slept. And the war machine of the Vurhaan Ascendancy, which had spent 400 years teaching the galaxy to be afraid, learned in a single morning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of an enemy that had done its homework, closed its eyes, crept into the room, and was now, with terrible and surgical patience, turning on the lights. The Battle of the Orus Drift lasted 6 hours, and it was not a battle so much as a reckoning delivered at the range of a whispered word. The Vurhaan fleet that had murdered Meridian Reach numbered over 400 capital ships, and on paper it was one of the most powerful concentrations of force in that arm of the galaxy. But a fleet is not its ship count. A fleet is its readiness, its awareness, its command, its magazines and its crews, and the 1,000 fragile assumptions it makes about where the enemy is and is not. The human doctrine had spent 4 days and 4 decades before that systematically dismantling every one of those assumptions. When the shooting started, half the Vurhaan capital ships had cold reactors. A quarter had crews at less than half strength, the rest on leave in the staging habitats. The command vessels, where the wardens who could have coordinated a defense slept, were among the first struck, because the map of guilt had marked them in red, and the human fleet had crossed the void specifically to reach them. Aveline's frigate had a small part in a vast machine, and she performed it with a cold clarity that frightened her a little afterward. Ganymede's vigil ran interdiction on a cluster of Vurhaan escort craft that tried to break formation and flee inward toward the civilian systems. This was a thing the human commanders had anticipated and dreaded, Vurhaan warships running for the cover of population centers, forcing the humans to either let armed enemy combatants escape to fight another day or pursue them into the very civilian space they had sworn to protect. The doctrine had an answer, and it was the hardest of all the answers, and Aveline lived it that morning. You do not follow them into the cities. You get ahead of them. You cut the vector, not the population. Ganymede's Vigil and 3 sister frigates burned every reserve of fuel they had to slingshot around the staging system's primary and put themselves between the fleeing escorts and the nearest inhabited world. And there, in open space with nothing behind them but stars, they stopped the escorts cold. 2 of the Vurhaan escort captains understood what was happening and struck their colors, transmitted the surrender code, killed their weapons, went dark and still. Human boarding teams took them alive. The 3rd captain did not surrender. He accelerated, straight at Aveline's line, trying to punch through and reach the civilian world. And for 11 seconds Aveline Sarne held the entire meaning of Operation Alien Extinction in her 2 hands on the fire control of a frigate. If she let him through, an armed enemy warship reached a world of innocence, and whatever he did there was on her. If she fired, she killed a crew of Vurhaan who had, in the last analysis, been born into the same machine that made Osk Tavine, following the same orders, wearing the same fear. Neither of them, the captain or the commander, had chosen the ascendancy any more than a fish chooses water. She fired. She fired to stop a warship that was charging a civilian world, which was the one thing the doctrine permitted and required, and the escort came apart. And Aveline was sick in the seconds afterward in a way she did not let anyone see, and she has said since that she thinks about the 3rd captain more than she thinks about anyone she saved. This is what it costs, she would say, to do the thing correctly instead of the thing that is easy. The easy thing would have been to hate them all equally, to fire at everything Vurhaan with a clear heart. The correct thing was to fire only at the warship charging the innocents, and to carry the weight of it alone, and to know the difference between the two even when your grief was screaming that there was none. By the end of the 6 hours, the Meridian fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Not one civilian world in the staging systems had been touched. The human commanders had, in several cases, actively defended Vurhaan civilian traffic caught in the crossfire, escorting panicked agricultural haulers and passenger liners out of the engagement zone, an act so incomprehensible to the Vurhaan aboard those vessels that the recordings of their confused, disbelieving transmissions would later become some of the most studied documents of the war. An enemy that killed your fleet and saved your grain ships. It did not fit. It could not be made to fit. And the not fitting spread inward through the ascendancy like a crack through stone. Warden Primarch Osk Tavine learned that his fleet was gone 11 hours after it was gone, because that was how long it took the news to cross the silence where his listening posts used to be. He did not believe it. This is recorded. He accused the courier who brought it of desertion and cowardice, and had the courier detained. He convened his war council in the high citadel above Vurhaan Prime and ordered them to explain how a young species with a patrol navy had destroyed the most powerful fleet in the sector, and the war council could not explain it, because the explanation was a doctrine they did not have the concepts to parse. When his intelligence officers laid out what the humans had actually done, the 4 days of silent blinding, the crossing of the frontier undetected, the strike delivered from kilometers, the deliberate and total sparing of every civilian world, the enemy warships escorting Vurhaan grain haulers to safety, Tavine's response was to reject it as propaganda. No enemy did that. No enemy who had the guilty fleet at their mercy declined to also burn the cities. It was not in the Ascendancy's 400 years of experience. Therefore it was a lie, a psychological operation, a trick to make the Ascendancy hesitate. And so Tavine made the decision that would, more than any human weapon, seal the fate of his regime. He decided that the way to break the human resolve was to do again what had always worked before. He would cull a second world. He would find another human colony and erase it on the broadcast bands, and this time he would make it larger and slower and more beautiful, and the humans would learn, as every species before them had learned, that the Ascendancy could not be answered. He gave the order to assemble a second culling fleet from the home defense reserves. It took time. The best fleet was dead, and pulling ships from the core defense grid met resistance from officers who, unlike Tavine, had begun to grasp that something without precedent was moving toward them. But Tavine was Warden Primarch, and his word carried the weight of 4 centuries of successful atrocity, and the second fleet began to gather above Vurhaan Prime. He never got to use it, and the reason he never got to use it is the part of the story that humanity would tell its own children afterward, the part that answered the old Martian delegate's warning about becoming a mirror of the enemy, because the way the second fleet was stopped was the truest expression of the entire operation. The human intelligence effort had, by this point in the war, penetrated the Ascendancy far more deeply than the wardens understood. Every captured technician, every interrogated courier, every surrendered escort captain who chose to talk had added to a picture that was now nearly complete. The humans knew about the second fleet before it finished assembling. They knew where it was gathering, and they knew something else, something that the map of guilt and the map of the spared had been built precisely to reveal. They knew that the second culling fleet was assembling above Vurhaan Prime, in orbit over the Ascendancy's homeworld, a planet of 9 billion Vurhaan civilians who had done nothing. This was the trap the Ascendancy had always relied on. Wrap the war machine in civilians. Assemble the atrocity fleet over the homeworld, where any enemy who struck it would rain debris and fire on 9 billion innocents, where any human commander with a conscience would have to choose between letting the second Meridian happen and becoming the very thing they had come to punish. 400 years of prey species had faced that exact choice and had always flinched. The Ascendancy did not even think of it as a strategy anymore. It was simply how the world worked. The human commander who faced that choice was a fleet admiral named Idris Cho, and the choice was laid before her in a tactical hold not unlike the one where Aveline Sarne had watched the 2 maps hang side by side. The second culling fleet, forming up over 9 billion civilians. Strike it where it sat and kill uncounted innocents in the debris and fire. Or wait, and let it finish assembling, and let it depart to erase a second human world of 10 billion. That was the choice as the Ascendancy had designed it. 2 horrors and pick one. Admiral Cho refused the choice as designed, and the refusal is why the operation was what it claimed to be. She did not strike the fleet over the homeworld. She did the harder thing, the slower thing, the thing that cost more human lives and required a discipline that 400 years of Vurhaan predation had assumed no species possessed. She sent her ships in to take the Second Fleet apart in detail, ship by ship, in the narrow orbital corridors where each engagement could be fought clear of the atmosphere and the population below. Boarding actions, targeted strikes on drives and weapons rather than reactors, the surgical crippling of warships one at a time rather than the easy annihilation of the whole formation in a single fire. It was more dangerous by an order of magnitude. Human ships were lost doing it the hard way that would have survived doing it the easy way. Aveline Sarne's frigate was one of the ships that went into those corridors, and a third of Scalpel Group did not come out, and every human who died in that orbit died because their commanders had chosen the survival of 9 billion enemy civilians over the safety of their own crews. That is the sentence that humanity would carve, eventually, over the memorial to that battle, and it is worth setting down plainly because it is the whole answer to the old delegates' fear. Every human who died in that orbit died because their commanders had chosen the survival of 9 billion enemy civilians over the safety of their own crews. The Ascendancy had built a shield of innocence and assumed no enemy would pay to see through it. Humanity paid, in blood on purpose, at a price it did not have to pay, because the alternative was to let the innocents burn and call it necessity. And humanity had decided in a single night in the conquered chamber that it would rather lose its own people than become a thing that called the burning of innocence necessity. The Second Culling Fleet was destroyed in the corridors over Vurhaan Prime across 9 days of the hardest fighting of the war. When it was over, not one bomb had fallen on the homeworld below. 9 billion Vurhaan looked up from their cities and their farms and their universities, and saw the wreckage of their own war machine burning in the sky above them, put there by an enemy that could have burned them with it and had chosen, at terrible cost, not to. The recordings of that day, the Vurhaan civilians standing in their streets, looking up, trying and failing to understand, did more to end the Ascendancy than any human weapon. Because a regime survives on the story it tells its people about the world, and the Ascendancy's story had been simple and total. The strong erase the weak. This is the only law. We are the strong. Be grateful we spare you. And now, in the sky over the homeworld, 9 billion people had watched an enemy stronger than the Ascendancy decline to be the Ascendancy. The only law had a second clause, and the second clause had come from the very species the wardens had called vermin. Tavine watched it too, from the high citadel, and for the first time in 400 years of Ascendancy history, a warden Primarch understood that the pattern was broken, and that he did not know what would replace it. Aveline Sarne came out of the corridors over Vurhaan Prime with a burned face and a decimated crew, and a decoration she never wore, because she did not believe in decorating what those 9 days had been. Ganymede's vigil limped back to a forward mustering point trailing atmosphere from a dozen breaches, and Captain Rue, who had taken the ship into the corridors himself, at the front, because he would not order young officers into a place he was not willing to go, had a wound in his side that the ship's medic had packed and would not meet anyone's eyes about. He called Aveline to his quarters on the second day of the limp home. He was gray and he was quiet, and he had the look of a man doing arithmetic on his own remaining time. She stood at attention, and he told her to stop it and sit down, and she sat. "You're going to command a ship," he said, "sooner than you think, sooner than is fair to you. And when you do, someone is going to lay a choice in front of you like the one Admiral Cho got, and it's going to be dressed up as a necessity, and it's going to be the easy horror or the hard one, and every instinct you have is going to want the easy one because you'll be grieving and you'll be scared, and the easy one will feel like justice." He shifted, and something in his side cost him for it. "I want you to remember the corridors. I want you to remember that we went in the hard way and we died doing it, and it was right, not because it felt good. It felt terrible. It was right because of what it made us. Do you understand the difference? The Vurhaan do the thing that feels like strength. We did the thing that was strength. That's the whole war, Aveline. That's the only thing this whole war has been about." She said she understood. She was 26 and she did understand, in the way you understand a thing you have paid for, and she carried it out of that room and into the rest of a life that would be defined by it. Captain Rue died 11 days later of the wound he would not meet anyone's eyes about at the forward mustering point with his ship around him. And the operation moved into its final movement, the one that would reach all the way up the crowned pyramid of the Ascendancy to the man who had scored the death of 10 billion people to music. And it would reach him in a way that answered the atrocity completely and looked nothing at all like the atrocity. And that was the entire point, and it always had been. There is a chapter of the war that the histories almost always compress into a single line, and it deserves better, because it is where the whole thing was decided long before the first ship ever moved. It is the chapter of the Woken Reserve, and of the 100,000 ordinary humans who built the instrument of the reckoning, and in the building of it, argued the operation into the shape it finally took. The reserve was not a fleet in mothballs. That is the misunderstanding people carry. It was industry, the sealed, dormant capacity to make war faster than any enemy could unmake it, coupled to the sealed doctrine that governed how that capacity would ever be permitted to wake. When the conquered invoked requital, the sealed lines came alive across a dozen hidden systems, and the people who ran them were not admirals. They were foundry workers and reactor engineers, and the quiet, unglamorous men and women who could turn raw asteroid nickel into a warship in 11 days if you gave them the pattern and the reason. And humanity gave them both. On the same night the assembly voted, and something happened in those foundries that the wardens of the Ascendancy could never have predicted, because it had no analog in a culture built on the strong erasing the weak. The foundry workers asked what they were building the ships to do. They were told because command had learned the same lesson every captain would carry to every crew. An instrument like this could not merely be handed to people and trusted. It had to be understood by everyone who touched it, or it would drift, inevitably, toward the easy horror. So the foundry crews were briefed exactly as the fleets were briefed. Extinction as a message, aimed at the guilty. Mercy as a discipline enforced on themselves. And a young welder on one of the reserve lines, her name does not survive, only the record of what she said, entered into the requital logs by a supervisor who thought it mattered, stood up in the middle of a shift briefing and said that if the ships she was building were ever used to boil an atmosphere the way Meridian Reach had been boiled, she would rather her hands fell off than that they had built them. And the strange thing, the human thing, is that the room did not think she was being dramatic. The room agreed with her, and the agreement went up the lines, foundry to foundry, until it became a kind of second doctrine, unwritten but total, a promise the builders made to themselves about what their work was for. The reserve did not merely arm the operation, it conscienced it. The people who made the weapons refused, in advance, to have made the wrong thing. This is why, when the map of guilt and the map of the spared were drawn, they were drawn with the obsessive care that they were. It was not only command's discipline. It was that everyone knew, all the way down to the welders, that the whole meaning of the thing lived in the accuracy of those two lists, and that a single burned university, a single boiled farming habitat, a single city struck because it was easier than reaching past it, would have converted the entire war from a reckoning into an atrocity with a nobler press release. The humans did not trust themselves to get this right by instinct. They knew grief too well for that. So they built the walls into everything, into the doctrine, into the ships, into the briefings, into the empty courts standing ready before the first shot, into the very metal of the reserve. And then they held themselves to the walls with a ferocity they aimed at no enemy. Aveline Sarne did not see the foundries, but she met their product every day of the war, and once late, she met one of the welders, in the way that people met strangers in that time. A chance rotation through a repair dock where Ganymede's vigil was having its Meridian corridor wounds patched, and a foundry crew was working the hull beside a fleet crew. And for one shift, the makers and the users of the instrument stood in the same cold space. An older welder, watching the young scarred officer supervise the patching of a breach where 3 of her people had died, asked her the only question the makers ever really wanted answered. She asked whether the ships had been used the way they'd been promised, whether the walls had held. And Aveline, who had fired on the 3rd escort captain and gone into the corridors and would soon stand in the high citadel and choose the arrest over the killing, told her the truth. She said the walls had held. She said it had cost them, that human crews had died going the hard way when the easy way was right there, that a 1/3 of her own group had not come out of the corridors over the homeworld, that the operation was slower and bloodier and more dangerous in every single engagement precisely because of the walls. And then she said the thing that made the old welder set down her tools and stand very still. She said, "But every one of us who died holding the wall died proving they were wrong about us." The Vurhaan built their whole empire on the idea that a species will always choose the easy horror when it's grieving and afraid. We are the counterexample. That's what your ships are for. Not to win, to be the counterexample. And they're working. The welder went back to her foundry after that rotation, and the record notes that she requested to be assigned to the lines building the medical and rescue tenders rather than the warships, the ships that would escort Vurhaan grain haulers out of engagement zones, the ships that would carry prisoners home, and that she worked those lines for the rest of the war, and that she wept once when the recordings of the homeworld spared sky came back down the broadcast lattice, because she understood that the ships she had built with her own hands had reached past 9 billion strangers and not touched them, and that this was the thing her whole life's work had been for. It is worth pausing, too, on the neutral systems, because they were the proof that the strategy of the true target, the story, not the fleet, was working while the war still raged, and because Aveline touched their edge and it changed something in her. Rue's watch drew an escort assignment in the final months, before the Citadel, shepherding a human relief convoy through a mid-system that had declared itself neutral. Neutral was, as Delacre had said long before, a concept the Ascendancy had no proper word for, and watching a Vurhaan world live inside that impossible in-between was one of the strangest experiences of Aveline's war. The system had War Machine in it, a shipyard that had, months earlier, fed the Meridian fleet, and therefore sat on the map of guilt in red. But the world around the shipyard had turned. Its people had watched the homeworld spared sky, had heard the released technicians, had asked the question that was dissolving the Ascendancy, and they had decided, collectively and without any human urging, that they wanted no part of the wardens anymore. And so a thing happened at that shipyard that no plan had scripted. The Vurhaan workers shut it down themselves. They powered down the war lines, they walked out, and they transmitted to the approaching human force not a surrender. They were not soldiers, they had nothing to surrender, but a declaration that the yard would build no more warships for the atrocity, and that the humans were welcome to verify it, and that they asked in return only to be left to live. The map of guilt had marked the yard in red. The humans arrived to strike it and found it already dark, already refused by the very hands that had once built the culling fleet, and Admiral Cho's staff made a decision that Aveline heard about and never forgot. They took the yard off the map of guilt. They did not strike it. They verified the shutdown, they logged the workers' refusal, and they moved on, because the yard was no longer part of the machine that had murdered Meridian Reach. It had removed itself from the machine, and the whole point of the operation was to reach the machine and only the machine, and a thing that had unmade itself was no longer a thing to be unmade. Aveline flew escort over that dark shipyard and watched the Vurhaan workers below going about the strange new business of a life without wardens, and she thought about the 3rd escort captain she had killed, the one she thought about more than anyone she'd saved, and she understood something that she would carry to the academy on Halden's Green and teach for the rest of her life. She understood that the walls were not a limit on the operation. The walls were the operation. Every act of restraint was not a subtraction from the reckoning, but the very thing delivering it, because each spared civilian and each refused strike, and each released prisoner was another witness, another crack in the story, another Vurhaan looking up and asking the question that no fleet could ever have made them ask. The Ascendancy had believed that mercy was weakness, and that a merciful enemy could be endured until it exhausted itself. Humanity had turned mercy into a weapon more total than any the reserve could forge, a weapon that did not kill the enemy's soldiers but unmade the enemy's reasons, that reached not the body of the Ascendancy but the belief that held its body upright, and that left, when it was finished, no empire to rebuild because the thing that had made it an empire had been proven, in front of 9 billion witnesses, to have been a lie the whole time. She did not have words for all of that at 27, flying escort over a dark yard. But she had the shape of it, the way she'd had the shape of the two halves of the operation locking into place inside her on the first day in the compartment while Rue told a room full of frightened people what the walls were for. And when she stood, a few months later, in the high citadel with a weapon she chose not to raise, it was the dark yard and the spared sky and the released technicians and the welder who built rescue tenders and Rue bleeding in his quarters and the third escort captain and Tessie the engineer girl she'd never see grown. It was all of them, the whole architecture of a war fought correctly instead of easily, that stood in the room with her and made the hard thing possible. She did not choose the arrest over the killing because she was better than her grief. She chose it because 100,000 people, from the foundry welders to the turned garrison sergeant, had already chosen it before her, and had built a war around the choosing, and she was only the last hand on a wall that a whole civilization had spent a year and a river of its own blood holding up. That is the part the histories compress into a line, and it is the part that mattered most, and it is why the reckoning at the top of the citadel could be a reckoning and not a murder. The man who scored 10 billion deaths to music was answered, in the end, not by a single grieving officer with a weapon, but by the slow, deliberate, agonizing decision of an entire species to be, at the one moment it had every excuse not to be, exactly the thing its enemy had sworn it could never be. The Ascendancy came apart from the inside before humanity ever reached the citadel. This was not an accident, and it was not luck. It was the deepest layer of the doctrine humanity had written 70 years earlier, the layer beneath the blinding and the surgical strikes, and it was aimed not at the war machine but at the thing that held the war machine together, the belief. For 400 years the Ascendancy had cohered around a single story, and the story was that the strong erased the weak and that resistance was not merely futile but incoherent, a category error, like a crop resenting the scythe. Every Vurhaan officer, every warden, every citizen had been raised inside that story. And humanity, having studied the Ascendancy with the patience of a species that had decided to answer an atrocity correctly rather than quickly, had understood that the story was the true target, and that the story could be broken not by killing Vurhaan, but by making the story false in front of them. The destruction of the two culling fleets had cracked it. The sparing of the homeworld had cracked it deeper, but the thing that shattered it was quieter and stranger and more human than any of that, and it began with the 12 terrified listening post technicians that Sergeant Okonkwo's team had refused to vent into space on the first night of the war. Those 12 had been questioned and had talked and had then been held, not in a cell in the classical sense, but in a section of a human depot ship where they were fed and treated and, crucially, allowed to watch. They watched the human fleet fight the corridors over their homeworld and decline to burn it. They watched human medics treat wounded Vurhaan prisoners with the same triage priority as wounded humans, because that was another wall and it held. They watched an enemy that had every reason in the galaxy to hate them behave, day after day, in a way the story they had been raised inside said was impossible. And somewhere in those weeks, the 12 technicians stopped being prisoners in their own minds and became witnesses. When humanity eventually offered to repatriate them, an offer the Vurhaan command could not comprehend and assumed was a trick, The 12 went home carrying something more dangerous to the Ascendancy than any weapon. They went home carrying the truth that the story was false, and they had seen it with their own eyes, and they could not be unseen. Multiply that by every prisoner humanity took alive and released. Multiply it by every civilian convoy a human warship escorted to safety. Multiply it by the recordings of the homeworld sky, distributed by humanity on the same broadcast lattice the Ascendancy had once used to show 10 billion people dying to music, except that humanity used it to show the opposite, to show restraint, to show an enemy declining to become a monster, and it let the Vurhaan people draw their own conclusions. And the conclusions spread. The frontier worlds first, then the mid-systems, then the core. Vurhaan citizens began to ask a question that had not been askable inside the Ascendancy's story for 400 years. If the humans, whom our wardens called vermin, will not burn our children even in vengeance for their own murdered billions, then what does that make our wardens, who burned 10 billion for a lesson? The Ascendancy did not fall to a fleet. It fell to that question, asked 10 billion times, in kitchens and universities and barracks across 1,000 worlds. Aveline Sarne received her own command in the 9th month of the war, exactly as Captain Rue had told her she would, sooner than was fair. The ship was a new-build corvette off the Woken Reserve lines, sharp and cold and smelling of sealant, and its name was Rue's Watch, because Aveline had requested it and no one in the fleet had the heart to refuse. She was 27 now. She had a scar down one side of her face from the corridors, and a way of going very still before she made a decision that her crew learned to read as thinking, and she carried the whole architecture of the operation inside her the way you carry a thing you have paid for in full. Rue's Watch was assigned to the final movement, the one aimed at the crowned pyramid, and Aveline understood the assignment as both an honor and a test, because the final movement was where the operation was most likely to betray itself. It is one thing to spare a civilian world you have no particular reason to hate. It is a harder thing to spare the war machine's soldiers when they surrender. It is the hardest thing of all to reach the man who scored 10 billion deaths to music, and to bring him to an end in a way that is justice, and not the atrocity turned around. To answer Osk Tavine without becoming a second Osk Tavine, which is what every fiber of a grieving species screams to do. Warden Primarch Osk Tavine had, by the final month of the war, lost most of his empire not to human weapons, but to the question spreading through it. His outer wardens had begun to surrender their fleets to human forces rather than fight for a story they no longer believed. His mid-systems had declared, one after another, a thing the Vurhaan language had no proper word for and had to borrow from the human broadcasts. They had declared themselves neutral, which in Ascendancy terms was a kind of impossible in-between that the old story said could not exist. And the core worlds, the 9 billion over whose heads the corridors had been fought, had turned. Not into human allies. They owed humanity nothing and humanity claimed nothing from them, but away from Tavine, which was worse for him, because a warden without a people to frighten is only a man in an expensive room. Tavine retreated into the high citadel above Vurhaan Prime with what remained loyal to him, a hard core of the officers who had planned Meridian Reach, the ones who could not turn because their guilt was too specific and too documented, the ones the human map of guilt had marked in red from the very first night. They were the war criminals proper. Not the technicians, not the conscripts, not the grain hauler crews or the 9 billion below. These were the architects, the ones who had chosen the amber star and named the population figures and set the music. They knew they were on the map. They knew what was coming for them. And they did the last thing the old story had left them. They wrapped themselves in the citadel, which sat above 9 billion civilians, and they broadcast a demand of their own to the approaching human fleet. Strike us here, and you rain the citadel down on the homeworld. Come for us, and you become us. It was the same trap, played one final time at the top of the pyramid by the men who had invented it. Aveline Sarne's ship was one of the first to reach the high orbit of Vurhaan Prime, and she read Tavine's broadcast on her bridge with a stillness her crew had learned meant she was thinking. And she thought a long time, because everything the war had been about was gathered into this single point of the sky. The plan that humanity executed against the Citadel was not Aveline's alone. It was the work of Admiral Cho and her staff and the human intelligence effort, and, in a way that mattered, the 12 technicians and every other Vurhaan who had chosen to become a witness. But Aveline's ship had a part in it that put the whole meaning of the operation into her young hands one final time, and she has said since that she is glad it was her, because she had been to the corridors, and she knew the price of doing it correctly, and she was not going to let anyone pay a cheaper, dirtier price at the very end. They did not strike the Citadel. Of course they did not strike the Citadel. Tavine had built his last trap on the assumption that his enemy would either flinch or become him, and humanity had spent a year and a river of its own blood establishing that it would do neither. Instead, the human forces did the thing that the entire operation had been building toward, the thing that was only possible because of every wall they had held and every innocent they had spared and every prisoner they had released. They went in and took the Citadel from the inside, the way Scalpel Group had taken the listening posts on the first night, except that this time they did not go in alone. They went in with the Vurhaan, because that was what a year of restraint had bought. The core worlds had turned, the neutral systems had turned. Even the Citadel's own garrison, the ordinary Vurhaan soldiers who guarded the doors and manned the stations and were not on any human map of guilt, had begun to understand what the men above them had done and what those men were now willing to do to 9 billion civilians below to save their own skins. When the human boarding teams reached the Citadel, they did not have to fight their way through the garrison. The garrison had already decided. Vurhaan soldiers opened the doors of the Citadel to the humans and then stood aside, or in more than a few cases went in ahead of them, because the reckoning that was coming for Tavine was theirs to want too, and the humans. This was the last wall, and it held, and it was the hardest one. Let them want it, and made room for it, and did not try to own it. Aveline Sarne was aboard the boarding action. She had insisted on it, over the objections of a staff that felt a corvette captain had no business in a boarding party, and Admiral Cho had overruled the staff, because Cho understood that this particular action needed a witness who had been to the corridors, a young officer who had fired on the 3rd escort captain and been sick about it, and knew exactly what line they were all walking. Aveline went in with a mixed party of humans and turned Vurhaan garrison soldiers, up through the levels of the high Citadel, past the triumphal frieze of Meridian Reach that Tavine had commissioned and never finished, its stones showing the amber star and the boiling atmospheres and the population figures carved in Ascendancy numerals, a monument to an atrocity, half-cut, abandoned by the artisans who had fled the story's collapse. And at the top, in the room where 400 years of the strong erasing the weak had made its last stand, they found the architects of Meridian Reach. Warden Primarch Tavine was not what Aveline had expected, and afterward she decided that this was the point, that monsters are never what you expect, because the thing that lets a person score 10 billion deaths to music is not a feigned horror but a certainty, a total and comfortable certainty that some lives are ledger entries and some are not. He stood in the high chamber with the remaining architects of Meridian Reach around him, perhaps 40 of them, the hard documented core that the human map had marked in red from the first night. Some had weapons, most did not. Tavine himself was unarmed, dressed in the pale formal robes of his office, and when the boarding party came through the door, humans and Vurhaan together, which was the sight that finally seemed to reach him, he did the only thing his 400-year story had left him. He appealed to it. He drew himself up and addressed the Vurhaan soldiers among the party, not the humans, and he told them, in the dialect the translation engines rendered flat, that they were committing the one unforgivable act, that they had let the vermin into the house, that the strong did not open their doors to the weak, that history would record their shame. And a Vurhaan sergeant of the Citadel garrison, an ordinary soldier whose name is preserved in the records because he asked that it be, answered him. He said, and the humans present did not prompt this, did not script it, did not even fully understand it until the translation caught up. He said, "You told us they were vermin. You told us the vermin would burn our children if they ever got the chance. And then they got the chance, Warden. They got all of our children, 9 billion of them, right there under this rock at their mercy, and they died in the sky over our heads rather than let one bomb fall. You told us what the strong do. Now I have seen what the strong do, and it was not you." And he lowered his weapon, and he stepped back, and he made room because he understood, they all understood in that room, that this reckoning did not belong to him, and it did not belong to a rifle. It belonged to the thing humanity had built across a year of terrible restraint, and it was arriving now, and it looked nothing like Ascendancy had ever been able to imagine. Aveline Sarne stepped forward. 27 years old, scar down her face, the whole architecture of the operation carried inside her in full, and she did not kill Ascendancy. This is the climax, and it is worth setting down exactly, because everything the story has been about lives in what she did and did not do. Every fiber of her wanted to. She had lost a girl named Tessie she would never be able to prove she had lost. She had fired on the 3rd escort captain and been sick about it. She had gone into the corridors and lost a third of Scalpel Group and buried Captain Rue. She had every reason a person can have to raise a weapon and answer the music of 10 billion deaths with a single clean shot in a high stone room. And she has said since that, in the half-second she stood in front of him, she felt the whole weight of the easy horror pulling at her like gravity. And she did the hard thing instead, the thing the whole war had been about, the thing Rue had made her promise in his quarters while his side bled. She placed Ascendancy and the 40 architects of Meridian Reach under arrest. She spoke the formal words that the empty courts back in the Concord had been waiting a year to hear. The courts convened and standing ready before the first shot was fired, because humanity had known from the first night that this was where it had to end. Not in a killing, but in a reckoning. Not in the dark, but in the light. Not answered by one grieving officer with a weapon, but by the whole of a civilization looking at what had been done and naming it, in open session, before every world that cared to watch. "You are detained," she told him, "for the murder of the people of Meridian Reach. You will be tried, you will be heard. And so will they." And she meant the 10 billion, and she meant the 9 billion below, and she meant every witness the war had made. And Ascendancy looked at her with the certainty draining out of his face, because a killing he could have understood, a killing would have made him a martyr in the old story, a killing would have proven the vermin were what he said. But a trial meant the story was over. A trial meant the strong did not, after all, simply erase the weak, that there was a second clause, and the second clause had teeth, and the teeth were about to close on him in the full light of a galaxy that had watched him decline to burn. That is how Operation Alien Extinction ended, and it is worth being precise about what it did and did not extinguish, because the title was a message, and the message was true, only not in the way Ascendancy had assumed. It did not extinguish the Vurhaan people. 9 billion of them lived on the homeworld that humanity had bled to spare. The frontier and the mid-systems and the neutral worlds lived. The technicians lived, and the conscripts and the grain hauler crews, and the artisans who had fled the unfinished freeze. What Operation Alien Extinction extinguished was exactly what humanity had named on the first night in the conquered chamber, and never once wavered from. The war machine that had murdered Meridian Reach, dismantled to the last dry dock. The crowned pyramid of officers who had planned and ordered and celebrated the atrocity, brought to a reckoning in open court. And the impunity, the 400-year certainty that the strong could erase the weak and pay nothing, broken so completely, and witnessed so widely that no Vurhaan child would ever again grow up believing it was the only law. The Ascendancy, as an engine of atrocity, was made extinct. The Vurhaan as a people were left alive to build whatever they would choose to build without the monsters who had ruled them, and the choosing was theirs, and humanity claimed no part of it, and that too was a wall, and it held. The trials took 2 years, and they were held in open session, and every world that wished to could watch, and many did, humans and Vurhaan alike. Octavian and the architects of Meridian Reach were heard in full, which was more than they had given 10 billion people, and the hearing was itself a kind of answer, that a civilization can look directly at the worst thing done to it and respond with a courtroom instead of a pyre, and that this is not weakness but the most demanding form of strength there is. They were convicted, they were sentenced, and the sentences, argued over for months by a species that had decided it would rather agonize than become a monster, were not death, because humanity had concluded in the end that to answer the man who scored 10 billion deaths to music by staging his own death for the broadcast bands would be to let him write the last verse in his own key. He was sentenced instead to be forgotten, to live out his years in a plain cell on a quiet world, unnamed in the histories except as a warning, his frieze left unfinished, his triumph converted into the single most studied example of what the galaxy would no longer permit. It was, several Vurhaan witnesses said, a heavier sentence than death, and they had reason to know. Aveline Sarne testified at the trials, once briefly. She was asked to describe the moment in the high chamber when she chose the arrest over the killing, and she was asked, by a Vurhaan advocate, in fact, one of a new generation of Vurhaan jurists that the war had made possible, whether she had wanted to kill him. She said yes. She said she had wanted it with everything she was. And then she was asked why she had not, and she was quiet for a while in the way her old crew would have recognized as thinking. And then she gave the answer that got carved, eventually, over the memorial at Meridian Reach, beneath the names that could be recovered, and the vast blank spaces for the 10 billion that could not. Because they told us we were vermin, she said, and vermin was a word for a thing you are allowed to erase without asking who it was. And the whole war, everything we did, every wall we held and every one of us who died holding it, was one long answer to that word. We were never going to prove we were not vermin by erasing them. You cannot answer a lie by living up to it. We proved it by reaching all the way into the house that murdered our children, past 9 billion people we could have burned and taking only the guilty, and leaving the rest alive to see us do it. That is the difference between us and the thing we fought. It is the only difference that ever mattered, and it is worth every one of us who paid for it, and I would pay again. She was 29 when she said that. She lived a long life afterward and commanded larger ships, and eventually stopped commanding ships at all and taught, at an academy on Haldan's Green 6 light-years from the Amber Star, where she told a new generation of young officers the thing that Rue had told her in a bleeding room, that there is an easy horror and a hard justice, that they will always be dressed to look alike, that grief will always argue for the easy one, and that the entire meaning of a civilization lives in its willingness to pay the higher price for the harder thing. She kept a photograph on her desk of a colony that no longer existed, 10 billion lives as a soft point of light, and beside it, though she never explained this to her students, a second image. The sky over Vurhaan Prime on the day the corridors were fought, 9 billion strangers looking up at a wreckage that had not fallen on them, at an enemy that had chosen, at terrible cost, not to be a monster. The Vurhaan built their own memorial in the end on the homeworld, under the sky where the corridors had been fought. It did not name humanity as a savior, because humanity had not been one and had never asked to be called one. It named, instead, the day the story broke, the day 9 billion people looked up and understood that the strong erasing the weak had never been a law of the universe, but only a lie told by frightened men in expensive rooms, and that the lie had been broken not by mercy alone and not by force alone, but by the two of them held together in balance at a price, by a young species that had lost 10 billion of its own and had answered by refusing, with everything it had, to become what had killed them. And that is what they broadcast in the end, not the death of 10 billion, which the Ascendancy had shown to make the galaxy afraid, but the day the fear ended, which humanity showed to make it impossible to begin again. The two broadcasts hang side by side in the archives now, on 100 worlds, and every student who studies the war is made to watch them both, in order, the atrocity and the answer, and to sit with the distance between them, because the distance between them is the whole of the thing worth knowing. One was scored to music, the other needed none. And of the two, it was the silent one, the reckoning that spared 9 billion and jailed 40, and left a whole people free to choose their own future, that the galaxy remembered and feared, and never forgot. The day the vermin came into the house of the strong, reached past everyone who was innocent, and took only the guilty, and by that single terrible act of restraint proved forever which of them had ever truly been the monster.